Yo guys, what's good? It's the Tominator back with another one. This time we're talking about the big boys. This is what we've all been waiting for, the men's open class. And I don't know about you, but holy cow, did they ever drag that night out? It felt like those women's events would never end. But anyway, this was your top four. The final call out from Prejudging, featuring Hadi Choopan, Big Ramy, Phil Heath, and defending Mr Olympia, Brandon Curry. And I'll tell you what, this was one of the hardest lineups to judge in a long time. Nobody really brought their A game. They were all a little off the mark, with the exception of Big Ramy, who brought possibly his all-time best package to date. But even so, the title is still very much up in the air. I'm sure that'll be reflected in the scorecards too. We'll probably see a lot of 1 or 2 point decisions in that top 4 to 6. In fact, I was struggling to call this one so much and wanted to make sure I got it right, so I had to go back and pore over some photos in addition to the webcast video, which, while it was pretty good for an online stream, it was also quite dark and washing out details on some of the competitors, particularly Brandon Curry and Big Ramy. I don't feel it did either one of them justice. So anyway, here's a pic of the front double biceps. As they say, it's a classic example of apples and oranges. Hadi Choopan is probably the driest and most conditioned. If you want size, it's Big Ramy all day. Balance and separation go to Phil Heath. Brandon Curry has the nicest shape and flow, so take your pick. I think Hadi has to be fourth because despite having the most separated quads and some great lats, he's coming up short, literally, size-wise, and looks a bit funky in terms of the proportions. His calves do not match the thighs, and the muscle bellies in his arms are rather short, making them look really thin around the elbows, so it's not an ideal outline. Brandon Curry is like the exact opposite. His outline is terrific, beautiful lines and flow, yet conditioning-wise, he looks kind of faded, and his lower body is the weakest of the four, especially when you factor in the calves. Phil, I think, looks better in this shot than the last time we saw him, because despite the midsection still being a wreck, and we'll get into that more later, he did manage to slim down those obliques at least a little. He's a bit more streamlined, so that really helps him here in the front double. But if I had to pick a winner, I'd probably go with Big Ramy. Yes, he looks blocky as hell. Yes, it's not exactly what you'd call a pretty physique, but this is the men's open class. It's never been about aesthetics, contrary to what a lot of fans might wish. At the end of the day, it's a muscle contest, right? And when you have this much mass and pretty decent conditioning, that's a hard combination to beat. But I can honestly see this one going to Brandon also. If you care more about symmetry and proportions, then Curry's your man. I have to admit, even his thighs look pretty good here. There's really not much difference between his quads and Phil's. They're both a little heavy on the adductors, and neither boasts a ton of separation, but Brandon must be flexing them hard here because they are showing more cuts than they will in later poses. Phil actually strikes a decent balance between the two. He's more complete than Brandon with better arm separation, and he's got better proportions and flow than Ramy. But you know what they say, a jack of all trades is a master of none. So Phil also tends to look a little underwhelming in this pose. He doesn't really grab your attention. So yeah, this one's got to go to either Curry or Ramy. In the front lat spread, Hadi looks awesome, super wide through the lats, and once again the wheels are top notch. He's definitely in contention here. Ramy is sort of like a bigger version. The lats don't stand out as much, but then again, he's got so much added density through the chest and shoulders, that kind of makes up for it. And the quad sweep is simply ridiculous. Phil doesn't look as bad as I thought he would here. I think streamlining his waist really helped because he looks pretty respectable right now. But let's be real, he's still on the outside looking in. There's no way he can win this pose with such a narrow frame. Brandon looks amazing though too. The commentators mention that he has an athletic look, and I absolutely agree. That's a great way to describe it. His taper is second to none, and he wins from the waist up. The question is, does that still hold true when you factor in the lower body? And I think the answer is probably not. He just has too much ground to make up when you compare his legs to Ramy's or Hadi's. And with the arms mostly out of the equation, I think the pose has to go to one of them. Probably Ramy for the aforementioned density and raw, overwhelming size. So I found the side chest very interesting, because from this angle, I think there is an argument to be made for Phil. He's got so much roundness upstairs with those crazy triceps and delts, and the pecs look good here. He's beating Brandon downstairs, and he's significantly sharper upstairs as well. So the battle is between him and Big Ramy. From this side, it's close, although Ramy's lower body detail is so deep, and his chest is thicker. Phil really only wins through the arms. However, he does something unusual, and turns to hit it from the other side as well, and now I think he loses it completely. His chest suddenly looks a lot more pinched and flatter, and his stomach is sticking out worse than before. It might look different depending on where exactly the judges are sitting, but from this camera angle, that proved to be a mistake. Big Ramy is easily whooping him now. His pecs are so much bigger and fuller, and he's even showing more separation through the legs, so Ramy clinches the side chest. As for third, we didn't get a good look, but I think that Hadi has his work cut out for him, giving up so much size to Brandon, who's basically a less conditioned version of Phil in this one. So even though he looked perhaps a little top-heavy, I'd still put Brandon ahead there. The back double was also surprisingly close. I think even his biggest haters expected Phil to run away with this one, but that's not how it played out. His hamstrings and glutes weren't as striated as we've seen in years past, and the lower lats didn't look as defined either. This photo right here is actually a lot more flattering than what came through in the webcast. You can indeed see plenty of grooves in his trailing hamstring, and the lower lats ain't bad at all. The glutes aren't as shredded as they used to be, though. I still think Phil edges it out by virtue of detail and separation, but there's an argument to be made for both Big Ramy and Brandon Curry. Hadi is definitely last, though, as this remains his weakest pose. So, Ramy's obviously got the size, with massive delts, arms, and even legs, since his quad sweep is still visible from the rear. But his lower back is pretty lackluster, and he's missing those finer details compared to Phil. Brandon is actually the greater threat here, as he has similarly awesome back development and a distinct width advantage as well. He's bigger and fuller upstairs, and cuts a better outline. But on the other hand, he's not as ripped and doesn't measure up downstairs. His legs look very thin from behind. So overall, I'd say that even though this is a far cry from his best, Phil is still the least flawed bodybuilder in this shot, so he takes it. In the rear lat spread, however, it's a different story. I don't think you can say that Phil's winning it anymore. We all know he was never the widest to begin with, but he thrived off of detail and conditioning, and usually still beat everyone in it. Not so this time around. His back lacks its usual crispness down the center, and I already mentioned his glutes and hamstrings weren't as good as they once were. He even appears to have lost some width too, so I don't think this is cutting it anymore. My vote goes to Big Ramy. Yes, Phil is still leaner, but is that minor edge in conditioning enough to overcome a major difference in width and mass? Not in my opinion. Ramy's as wide as a friggin' barn door here. The only thing I don't like is the way his lats insert. It makes his waist appear rather wide. But overall, I'd still probably give it to him. You could say that Brandon boasts a comparable level of width and has the prettier V-taper. But once again, I'd remind you to look downstairs and remember that this is open, not classic physique. For that reason, I might even rank Hadi above Brandon here. Choopan also shows greater thickness through the lower lat area. Now, contrary to what a lot of people are saying, I still have Phil winning the side triceps. I think as long as he keeps his midsection in check and holds the pose properly, he takes it. He's got the best triceps hands down. That lateral head is on another level. His shoulder and hamstrings are also top tier. Brandon looks good. I like his posing and proportions, and there's a lot to admire here. But again, he appears somewhat top heavy. From what I've seen so far, his side leg doesn't look as good this year compared to 2019. And I don't know, maybe it's just the way the lighting interacted with his dark skin, but I'm not seeing enough cuts. Everything on his body looks faded, almost like it's slightly out of focus. And I'm sorry, but that's just not the type of polish we should expect from a champion at the highest level. Meanwhile, Big Ramy is so dang big, he is literally struggling to hold the pose. He's not even hitting it properly half the time. It's too bad because he might have given Phil a run for his money. He was pretty dominant in the side chest after all, but I don't see how you can give this to him. Maybe in an earlier callout his execution was better, but it wasn't very good here. But in the ab and thigh, it's tough to outdo the big man. As we already established, Ramy's pretty chunky, to put it bluntly, but the amount of muscle in those quads is practically untouchable, plus his abs are very defined. Hadi strikes a nice balance between muscularity and conditioning. He's obviously not as huge, but he is drier than Ramy, and shows more detail through the obliques and serratus. I think you have to go with one of those two in this shot. My money's still on Ramy because he's bigger and has the better X-frame. I'm sure the more casual viewers among you would probably have Brandon Curry winning because he's got the more aesthetic physique, there's no question. But those legs continue to hold him back, and it has to be said, his abs have looked sharper in the past. Phil is still a lost cause in this pose. It's been his weakest pose for basically his whole career. Well, that or the front lat spread depending on the show. But even though his waistline is a little slimmer since the hernia surgery, it appears as though he's now missing half his ab muscles. It's not a good look, and for that reason, he's got to be last. Alright, and as we've witnessed so far already, it's tough to beat Big Ramy when he's on, and this holds true in the most muscular. He looks downright menacing in the hands-on hip. Even Hadi was marveling at those tree trunks down there. Then again, I gotta tip my hat to Phil. This one-arm hand-on hip looks great. The only thing marring it is the stomach, which unfortunately seems to be beyond the point of repair. Hadi looks amazing in this one. Imagine if you could somehow transplant his midsection onto Phil. Man, the gift's path to number 8 would surely be a lot easier then. But yeah, great abs, massive delts and quads. This is an excellent finisher for the Persian Wolf. The reigning champ looks superb in his own right, but other than the abs and a bit more width across the chest, I don't see how he beats Heath here in this comparison. Phil's showing a lot more muscularity right now. But you wouldn't be wrong to bet on Big Ramy. Even though Phil looks more muscular for his frame, when we're talking pound for pound, Ramy's just so much bigger structurally, it's hard for Phil to compensate for that. And lastly, in the crab most muscular, this was where I predicted that Brandon might be able to take him out. And as you can see, it is super close. On the one hand, Curry is actually now bigger and fuller than Phil in the upper body. He carves a better outline too with that superior shoulder to waist ratio. But Phil still has him beat in the conditioning and has more muscle maturity. He's just got so much going on there with all the chest striations, the hardness through the delts and arms, the veins in the quads. Honestly, this could go either way depending on how much emphasis you put into that versus frame and fullness. So once again, I think the battle for first comes down to the guys in the middle. And it depends on the variation. I'd say Big Ramy is probably too much to handle in the hands-on hip, but Phil still looks pretty dangerous in the hands clasped and the crab. So he's got greater versatility, and as long as he doesn't let his midsection relax too much, I think Phil hangs on here. But I couldn't fault you if you prefer Big Ramy. The man's a monster. As for the overall standings, it's gotta be close, very close. I believe I actually did give Big Ramy the majority of the poses this time, and wherever he did lose, he was still right there in the running, or at least fairly competitive. Whereas Phil was downright poor in a couple shots, namely the ab and thigh and front lat spread. So at this point, I think Ramy should objectively hold the lead going into the finals. But this is by no means a done deal. I think the placings will ultimately depend on how these guys come back on Saturday night, because right now, this is still too close to call. If you want my honest opinion, I'd say the battle has to be between Phil Heath and Big Ramy. I mean, they had those two standing in the center the entire time at the end, so that should tell you something. Brandon will need to sharpen up considerably in order to retain the Sandow. And if Ramy comes in even, say, 1 to 2% better, which could very well happen as we saw him sweating out some excess water, he could become the new champion. It could finally happen, assuming that politics doesn't come into play. And historically speaking, that's always been a real issue at the Olympia, so don't be surprised if it rears its ugly head again. But anyway, guys, that's enough yapping from me. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more, because it looks like we're going to be in for one hell of a ride. Please drop a like, share the video, and subscribe for more in-depth Olympia coverage, and we'll see you next time. And oh yeah, I almost forgot. I'll be back.